something different this morning. We're going to take the book, use the book this morning. If you have your book. You know, in the last few lessons, we have studied Amos, who prophesied to the people of Israel about their corruption, about their sin. Then we look at Habakkuk. We studied his 2 lessons concerning Habakkuk's prophecy. And we've seen where Habakkuk prophesied not to the people or to any kings, but it was a conversation between Habakkuk and God about the punishment that was going to come upon God's people. It was more or less complaints that Habakkuk made. Well, today we're going to look at another minor prophet. And that minor prophet is going to be Micah. And we're going to be in Micah, the 3rd chapter. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 3, verses 9 through 12. Then we're going to skip over to the 6th chapter of Micah and pick up verses 6 and 8. But you know, there's a interesting introduction to our lesson today. And that introduction tells about a funeral home that used to set up the nativity scene every year in front on the lawn of his funeral services. But on one year he did this, it was vandalized. The nativity scene was, and somebody had stolen the Christ child from the manger and had broken off all the fingers to the other statues and things. And also the wild animals. They left the fence open, let the sheep and the goats and the donkeys loose. Well, a few days later, whatever the reason was, the bandit did, or person that did the vandalizing, confessed and returned all the stolen figures. We can sympathize, I guess, somewhat to the funeral director with his frustration. But he said this: why people would come here to the funeral home and show such disrespect, I don't know. You have to have a warped mind to do something like that. Well, you know, Micah prophesies, and in his prophecy, he too tells about the guilty of having warped minds, talking about the people of his time, how they indulged in self-injustice and wrongdoings. But what really does God require of us today as Christians? What does he really require of us? Very little, doesn't he? God requires us to do what? Do things justly, doesn't he? To have justice in our life and to do things justly. He teaches us to love merciful, doesn't he? To show mercy to others. And then he teaches us to walk honorably in his ways. In Micah 3, where we want to be at, the source of today's study, we see a language reminiscent to that is found in the previous studies from Habakkuk. Habakkuk, however, was describing the conduct of the foreign Babylonians. But sadly, Micah is describing the behavior of those who are part of God's covenant people. And they should have known better. We all agree to that. But Micah is stuck right in the middle of the 12 minor prophets. Micah was prophesied somewhere around 785 to 734 BC. He was also contemporary, Micah was, to Isaiah in his prophecy. But Micah is going to talk today, and his prophecy is going to be against both kingdoms. Now remember, the kingdoms are split. Israel split. We have the northern and the southern kingdom. And in this period of time of Micah's prophecy, we have the Assyrians being very formidable in their war methods and coming to take over the northern and southern kingdoms. But before we do that, Micah is going to be prophesying about the abusive of their power that they had. But let's look back to the 20th century, the 19th century. If you go back and we see the day of Micah and compare it with things that we can relate to in our own history today, there was a man by the name of William Boss Tweed. How many's ever heard of that name? He lived from 1823 to 1878. But Boss Tweed was notorious for his corruption. He was so corrupt that and had so much control in New York that he controlled politics, businesses, and it's hard to realize that one man today had that much authority. But Tweed, as the story goes, bought 300 benches for the parks, paid $5 each for them. That's a pretty reasonable price. But he sold them back to the city for $600 each. Made a good profit, didn't he? Not only did he do that, but we're told also that he charged the city $7,500 for every thermometer that was put on the wall of the city hall. $41,190 for each bathroom that was installed. And nearly $5.7 million for just the furniture and the carpet alone. Tweed's graft today would be nearly $200 million for that city hall. Look at, if If you look at New York, just look at the New York City Hall. Just picture it as you see it. If you looked at what Tweed got from that City Hall, from all the building and everything, today's money, it would cost the New York City $200 million for that building. Well, we know that there was no happy ending in Tweed's life because due to all of his corruption and everything, he finally goes to prison and he dies in prison. We see corruption every day. Matter of fact, just this past week, we've seen what was called in-house trading being taken place by our own representatives, which you're not supposed to do. It's against the law. But we see even today in our own society injustice, corruption, dog-eat-dog lifestyle. If you got it, I'm going to take it. If you don't give it to me, I'm going to take it from you, that attitude. Abuse is not a power. It's not really anything new. The ancient prophet Micah, that we're going to study today, has the answer in his prophecy. And we see, as we look into our lesson, in Micah 3, verses 1, Micah says this, "Then I," talking about himself, "then I said," or I prophesied to, that word listen, transferred to the Hebrew, introduces the word prophecy. He said, I'm going to prophesy to you. Or I want you to listen to what I got to say, in other words. You leaders of Jacob and rulers of Israel. Remember now that Jacob's name was changed to Israel, wasn't it? Some commentators believe that this Jacob and Israel is interchangeable. Just means one word. But I take it to be this. I think it has a different meaning. I think has this way. Listen, you leaders. In other words, each family had a leader, didn't he? Each family in God's people, when he set it up, every clan and every family had leaders set up that was responsible for their decisions. And then they also set up rulers. We see that when Moses came with bringing the people out of Egypt. What did he do? He set up people over 200, people over 100, people over 50 to rule them. So either way, he says, I want you to listen now, Israel. I want you to listen now, families of Jacob, for what I've got to say. You, this is a rhetorical, you who you do not embrace justice, or should you not embrace justice? In other words, you know better. You know that you should uphold justice. But should you not know that you embrace justice? Why aren't you doing it? Micah begins his address to the leaders with a rhetorical question about their knowledge of justice here in this one verse. Justice requires God's people to behave in certain ways, doesn't it? To behave in a righteous standards. Exercising justice reflects a person's awareness of God's standards of right and wrong in their society. And Micah starts out here. Right off the bat, he said, you people, you leaders, you rulers, should you not know about justice? In other words, he said, you know about it. In a way, to me, it's a way that Micah is condemning them, but yet he's doing it in a nice way, through a rhetorical type question. And then we see in verse 2a, he says this, you, talking about the people now, you who hate good, you hate good. Now he's really laying the law down. He's now condemning them. He's really bringing them to their need. He said, you hate good. You don't want God's grace. You hate good, and you love all evil. The leaders hated good and traded good for the evil in their life. It's impossible for them to administer proper justice, he said to them. Their moral points is in the wrong direction. Their moral compass points them in the wrong direction. Why do we say that? Instead of pointing them to the good things, their morals are pointing them to evil. Both the northern and the southern kingdoms are guilty. They're both now rejecting the Lord's standard. If you go back and you look at the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, Israel never had any good kings. But if you look at Judah, it seemed like every other king was bad. Sometimes you would find two bad ones in a row. But at the time Micah comes along with his prophecy, they're just coming out from a good king. And then we see in 2b, and here's where Micah does start to do something that really wants to get at it, I think. And he knows that cannibalism, I believe, was a no-no all through the Jewish history. God condemned it from the very beginning. He condemned the Baal worship. He even condemned sacrificing of human bodies. And he also condemned the eating of the flesh. But now Micah is going to do something. He's going to show these leaders and these rulers, he says, you tear the skin from my people. You tear the skin just like you take a knife and just skin a deer or skin an animal. You've actually taken the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones. You've cut the flesh right off their bones. Micah uses this graphic language in portraying how offensive and destructive the leaders behavior he is. But that is not only the beginning of his shocking description. There are references to and predictions of literal cannibalism in the Bible even. You see that in 2 Kings chapter 6. But this is not one of them. Micah is telling them, his people, the leaders here, you are so ruthless. You're so corrupt. You have no mercy in you whatsoever. That you just tear the skin right from the people and you take the flesh right off the bones. And then he gets into a more graphic scene in verse 3. He said, who, talking about the people, the leaders, who eat my people's flesh. In other words, how corrupt can you get? How injustice can you be? How much mercy, unmercy that you don't show? You've even taken the people, my people, and you've actually taken their flesh. And you've actually stripped it off their skin. You break their bones, the pieces. You chop up like meat for a pan. Like the flesh for the pot. In other words, you've taken and you've got them ready now. All you've got to do now is eat them now. You've got them to that point. You are destroying my people. And that's what Micah is telling them here. We see even centuries later, Jesus even will describe to the leaders greediness when he speaks of how the teachers of the law, remember when he said they devour the widows' houses? And he talked about Paul does in Galatians. Remember in Galatians 5, Paul says this, but if you bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed by one another. Even Paul uses cannibalism type analogy along with Jesus. So Micah here is giving them the leaders and the rulers a very, very graphical scene of themselves, of how bad they are, how injustice they are, and how wrong they are in the sight of God. Well, let's look. Who was Micah really speaking of? Well, we know he's speaking of what? The leaders of the Jewish people, wasn't he? Speaking of the leaders and the rulers. The priest, in other words, one of the rulers. The priests were rulers. All the Levitical tribe, pretty much, where God's people ruled and did things. Even the clans and families that had their leaders in them, they were guilty also. But what were they supposed to be doing? Well, they were supposed to have been given what? Fair judgment. And they were supposed to have been what? Supporting justice. We find Micah divided in three. And here's something. In Micah 3, verses 4 through 8, the prophet declares that the Lord's judgment on the leaders. You find that in Micah 3 through 4:8. Then Micah exposes false prophets in Micah 3, 5 through 7. Micah contrasts their selfish motives with the divine authority that undergirds his own prophetic ministry. We see that in Micah 3:8. Then, verse 9, Micah now is giving warning. You know, anytime that Jesus or any of the prophets says, hear this, it was similar to say, whoa. Because it meant that if you didn't listen up and change, there was going to be something happen. And Micah says this in verse 9. Hear this, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, who despise justice. Now he's really putting them right. You despise it and you distort all that is right. In other words, you're using the law for your own benefit. We see that today, don't we? You even change the law, you distort it for what? For your own benefit, to make it apply to your situation. Micah again now calls on the leaders and the rulers of God's people to hear his message. But whereas in Micah 3:1, the prophet posed a rhetorical question to challenge the leaders in the matter of justice. Here, in verse 9, he bluntly accuses them of their unjust behavior. They actually despise justice, and they actually twist the meaning of it to suit their own selfish purpose. And we see examples of that also in Psalms 58, 1 and 2, and Isaiah 123. Then in verse 10, says this, you who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. Now we realize, and let me stop here, a lot of times in our scriptures, Zion and Jerusalem were interchanged. But if you go back and you study the history, there was one spot in Jerusalem that was actually called Zion. And then it became interchangeable with the whole nation of Israel. But he's accusing them now. He said, listen, you've actually built the buildings. And you know, last week we talked about the buildings, how they were built, how the walls, cried out. Now he said, these refer back, the buildings in Zion, you built them with bloodshed. What kind of the slave labor that you had? You went out and you got slaves. You mistreated them injusticeably. You starved them to death. You beat them. And we find also, if you go back in history under Pekah, the king of Israel at this time, when he was in how ruthless of a king he really was to his people. And he said, you have built Zion and you built Jerusalem by the bloodshed of innocent people with your own wickedness, your own injustice. Then in 11a it says, her leaders judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money. Notice what he's accusing the leaders and the rulers are doing. The things that he's accusing them to do are things that they should be doing for nothing. And he says, you judges, you judge for... We see that happen today. We see judges that, for political reasons, do different things, don't we? And he said, you priests, you who's supposed to take the sacrifices of the people, and you're supposed to send them up to me, God, you are charging a price above what the sacrifices are. And are prophets like me. Micah was a prophet. And he said, and her prophets, talking about Israel, her prophets tell fortunes for money. They were telling fortune tellers. They were telling with like a glass ball. They were telling them things that was going to have in the future in their lives so that they could, and they were charging money for it. And that wasn't what God's people, rulers, were supposed to be doing. And Micah says this in verse 11b, yet they look for the Lord. Talking about the rulers and the leaders. He says, yeah, they look for the Lord support. They look for their, after being so wicked and so ruthless, they're still looking for the Lord for His support. And they say to the Lord, is not the Lord among us? In other words, they're saying, because the Lord's with His people, He should be with us. No disaster. They had this knowledge. They said, no disaster is going to come on us for what we're doing. Because we're God's chosen people. We're put in this position by God. But Micah's telling them, says here, woe to you. Because what you're doing, God does not even hear. God does not even look down upon what you're calling. And then in verse 12 it says this, therefore, because of Zion, because of you rulers, because of you leaders, and I think here too, in this group here, I think it also goes a little bit farther down the line too to some of the people also. I think you is referred to all the people that was guilty of not obeying God at the time. He says, Zion, because of that, because of your wickedness, because of your injustice, Zion is going to be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the temple hill and mound overgrown with thickets. We find maybe a couple of centuries later, this verse here really taking place. When Titus comes right into Rome, the Roman emperor comes right in and he destroys not Jerusalem, not Titus, but the Babylonians rather. 586 BC. He comes in, the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar, and his army comes in and they just take Jerusalem and they just demolish it. I read an article where I think the writer of this story says that they made a visit to Jerusalem. And they saw where Zion, part of Zion, where it all showed wheat and barley fields. And where the old Jerusalem was, where it was just completely grew up. Well, Micah's telling them this day is going to come Because of what? Because of you. It's not that God wants to bring this judgment on you, but it's because you have failed to do what God says. Micah accuses the leaders of God's people for doing wrong. And his accusations was this: you hate judgment and you twist the meaning of the law to suit your own self-purposes. He also accuses them of their greed and their corruption, the leaders and the priests and the prophets, by saying this: the leaders judge for bribes. They give false judgment because of bribes. The priests are hired to teach. And he accuses the prophets of vying for money, prophesying for money. Also, Micah says this: what lie are these corrupt leaders telling themselves? The Lord is still with us, they said, so no evil will come our way. You know, a lot of people today in our society, you have I see three different groups of people. I see those who think there is no God. I see a group of people that says, yeah, there's a God, but he's not the same God in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's time as he is in our time. And I see those who says this: God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Micah saw these people as corrupt leaders because they thought just because that they were God's chosen people and that God was with his chosen people, that they would protect them in all of their wrongdoings even. But they find out later that when the wrath of God comes upon them, that that's not true. Then we skip over to Micah 6. Micah 6, verse 6 through 8. With what then shall I come? What should I bring before the Lord? In other words, what should I bring before the Lord? And how should I bow down before and exalt God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves, a year old? In other words, what the people are saying here is, what am I to come to God with? What kind of sacrifices? What kind of atonement am I going to get? Or should I give? Now the people are defended. They take the defense of themselves. They appear that instead of vindicating themselves or attempting to dispute what has happened, they allege against him. They seem at once to plead guilty to their sins. Because they're asking, what can I do now? What can I do to get an atonement? And are anxiously inquiring how they shall appear or appease God and his wrath, of the judgment that he will hand down to them. They realize now here in chapter 6 that Micah is telling them that they are guilty. They know they're guilty now. and they want to know what they can do for their atonement. What kind of sacrifice can I give God? What am I going to do to make God be happy? You know, that's the same questions asked every day of every Christian, isn't it? What am I going to do to please my Lord? Well, earlier, before we started our lesson, we sing, be justly, do things justly. God tells us, be just, be merciful, and to follow me. That's three things if we do that. Well, this is the same thing that these people hear. But Israel was a point in their life they thought and they believed that all they had to do was take an animal, give it to the priest, and the priest would give a sacrifice, and that would take care of it. But God even said to his own people, I don't want your sacrifices. I want your obedience. And in verse 7 it says, will the Lord be pleased? Now they're asking this, in my atonement, toward my atonement, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? You know, that's not impossible, but it's pretty much hard to do. It would be hard to do. And then they said, or with 10,000 rivers of olive oil. Well, that's impossible. But they're asking, if I had that, if I gave that, would that please God? Shall I offer my firstborn child like Abraham tried to offer Isaac? Will that be enough to appease God for my transgressions? The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. In other words, they're asking this, if I was to give thousands of rams with 10,000 rivers, and along with my firstborn, will that be enough to appease God for all the transgressions we've done? It wasn't, because that wasn't what God was wanting. God wasn't wanting something physical from his people. God was wanting something what? Spiritual from their heart. They wanted to give sacrifices that are physical sacrifices. God said, no, I want you. He has shown you, Micah says in verse 8, he has shown you, O mortal, you people, what is good. God has showed them from the time they left Egypt all the way through, up to now. He showed them everything that's good. And what does the Lord require of you? Oh, that's what Micah says. And this he follows up with this, Micah does, the same thing that we said earlier. All God requires, Micah says, is to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. If a person asks us today, what does it take for us to be a Christian after we have accepted Christ? My answer would be the same thing to that person. And it's not hard. If you just be just to people, treat people as just as you want to be treated, the old saying is. Show mercy to people as you would want people to show mercy to you. And to walk in the steps of the Master. That's all that we're asked to do. And this is what Micah's whole prophecy was. This is what his whole message was to the leaders and the rulers of Israel. He said this: it's not what you've given me. You're not giving it to me from your heart. And that's what we have to do as Christians today. Is walk with him spiritually. Thank you so much.